A very pleasant good morning to one and all present here. We are gathered here today for the International Conference on International Trade Law. The theme for the conference this year is International Trade in the Digital Era. I would now like to welcome our respected Dean, Professor Dr. T.R. Subramania, to present the welcome address.
A very good morning to all the dignitaries who are present here on this auspicious day. We have with us our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Registrar, and the Chairman as well as the Chancellor of the University. We have wonderful people today, and they have established a name on their own as scholars in the field. For their scholarship, they have been recognized by their country as well as outside their own country. We have today with us the great respected Professor Dr. David A. Gantz, Clayton Fellow for Trade and International Economics, and he is Professor of Eminence at the University of Professor of Emeritus, Baker Institute, United States. Sir, we are honored to have you. And when we just wrote a letter to him, and he is the first person to accept in all humility on behalf of the CMRU group of institutions and on behalf of the Chancellor, we as well as on the CMR School of Legal Studies, we welcome you honorably, sir. We have another person by name Professor Dr. Nazima Kamaruddin. She is Professor and Head Department of Commercial Law, University of Colombo. And she is the second person to be wrote, and she immediately replied. In spite of last minute difficulties, she was able to make it. And she is with us here. And she will be delivering the keynote address a little later. And Professor David Gantz will be delivering the inaugural address. Similarly, we have the Registrar of the University will also be with us. And on behalf of the University, once again, I welcome him. I also welcome all the participants who are with us, both online as well as here in itself, offline, and all the research scholars who were requested to join have joined, and most of them are through online mode, and all the dignitaries who are present. Once again, this is a very extensive area, and one of the subjects on which discussions are taking place throughout the world. Now, Professor Gantz will raise the issue. When the government changes, naturally a few developments which are going to come in the realm of World Trade Organization as well. So it is important for every country. See, the deliberations for the establishment of the WTO started taking place in 1986 on September 28th. And it took almost 9 years to complete the discussions. What was started as a formal discussion to review the trade aspects resulted in the establishment of international organization. And that international organization has been functioning since 2005, January 1st. And there are several deficiencies as well. How these deficiencies should overcome, and what measures are to be adopted, and what best we could discuss and find out. These are the few key issues which are to be discussed throughout the day. Once again, good wishes, best wishes. Please enjoy and learn.
For sharing such enlightening thoughts with us. It was truly inspiring. It is an honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. David A. Gantz. Sir is the Bill Clayton Fellow in Trade and International Economics and serves as a Samuel Berkeley Professor of Law Emeritus at the University of Arizona's James E. Rogers College of Law. With a career spanning academia and government, Sir has also served as Director Emeritus of College's International Trade and Business Law Program and serves as an affiliated faculty both in Latin American Studies Department and the Institute of Environment. Professor Gantz brings a wealth of teaching experience from prestigious institutions, including Georgetown and George Washington University, and universities across Latin America. Sir's teaching specialties include international trade and environmental law, NAFTA, international business transactions, and Latin American economic history. Earlier, in Sir's career, Sir spent time with the U.S. Agency for International Development, clerked for Judge Charles Merrill on the Ninth Circuit, and was the chief lawyer for Inter-American Affairs at the U.S. Department of the State. Dr. Gantz then practiced international trade and corporate law in Washington, D.C. before joining the University of Arizona in 1993. Over Sir's career, Mr. Gantz has served as a U.S. judge on the Administrative Tribunal of the Organization of American States and consulted for organizations like World Bank. Sir has authored 4 books and over 4 dozen articles and chapters on topics such as WTO and NAFTA trade law, dispute resolution, and foreign bribery. Sir holds an AB from Harvard and both JD and JSM from Stanford. It is my most humble privilege to invite you to present the inaugural address on the topic U.S. trade policy in 2025.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you on U.S. trade policies under Mr. Trump toward India and the world. I should caution, number one, a lot of what I'm saying is hopefully educated guessing, because Mr. Trump, of course, was just chosen as our president a few days ago. And secondly, I am speaking for myself, and my views do not necessarily reflect those of the Baker Institute or my colleagues at the Baker Institute. Just a second. We're having problems here. It's not working. Just a moment. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. There'll be a new administration. It will clearly be Mr. Trump's as of January 20th, 2025. In the trade and international area, the Trump administration will face a lot of challenges and probably find some benefits. Perhaps most significant is our ongoing trade war with China, including de-risking by encouraging companies in China exporting to the U.S. to move somewhere else, including but not limited to places like India, Vietnam, and Mexico. There are questions about a tariff policy. Mr. Trump's original tariffs 6 years ago imposed 25% duties on more than $350 billion worth of exports to the U.S. During the campaign, Mr. Trump said that he would impose 60%, rather than 25% duties. Obviously, he may or may not decide to do this, but that's what he said during the campaign. I think there will be some efforts, I don't know how significant, to improve trade and diplomatic relationships with India and other major developing countries. That's still, I think, in the future. A big issue for the United States is addressing the relationship with Mexico. Mexico is our largest source of imports. It obviously shares a almost 3,000-kilometer border with the U.S., and it's under the NAFTA successor, USMCA. There's supposed to be a review and renegotiation in about a year and a half, in 2026. I think we can all assume that Mr. Trump will maintain the Buy America, Invest in America, Employ Americans, essentially American first protectionism and industrial policies that he developed during his first term, and which Mr. Biden has generally followed as well in a little more diplomatic way. The concerns, I think, are with high tariffs that it will make U.S. goods more expensive to make and therefore less competitive worldwide, and cause inflation, which, as everyone is aware, was a very serious problem back 3 or 4 years ago, and was probably one of the main reasons why Vice President Harris lost the election. And there's an issue, I think, as well. It's a diplomatic issue as much or more of a trade issue as to U.S. relations with the Global South and others in a context where the U.S. is simply not going to negotiate any new free trade agreements and is not going to open its market in any significant way. So I think that is obviously something we all have to keep in mind. Just a second. I think a coherent policy to assure that U.S. enterprises avoid other nations' efforts to impose data localization. This has not been a big issue in the campaign, but particularly given Mr. Trump's support by some very important electronics companies, data companies like Apple and Amazon, and certainly X, Mr. Musk's company, I think it will eventually become an issue where the U.S. becomes more involved internationally than it has been under the Biden administration. I think Mr. Trump, more even than the Biden administration, than Mr. Biden or Mr. Harris, will be concerned with encouraging companies that want to sell goods in the U.S. to locate their manufacturing operations in the U.S. And it will probably discourage U.S. firms from investing abroad. I mean, obviously there are limits here. The U.S. is never again going to be producing large quantities of clothing or footwear or probably television sets, but there are other areas where the pressures may be very great. I think overall, being very blunt, the Trump administration will be much less concerned about India's treatment of Muslim minorities, Kashmiris, or suppression of political dissent than the Biden administration. But I don't really know how this will affect bilateral relations in a significant way. What are the Trump trade policies? Mr. Trump, including his advisors, including former U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who has been offered the job again in the new administration. He hasn't decided whether he's going to take it yet. There's some very significant concerns, and they're very controversial. There is a very broad belief that increased tariffs help U.S. businesses compete with foreign imports, while conversely, low U.S. tariffs encourage companies to locate in other countries, whether it's Mexico or China or maybe India. There also is an abhorrence, a very serious unhappiness with trade deficits, such as those that the U.S. runs with China, Mexico, and Vietnam, and the EU. For India, this is a much smaller problem as far as trade with the U.S. because there just isn't that much. Mr. Trump and his advisors also believe that countries that have much higher tariffs than the U.S. are unfair to the U.S. And this is, I think, ought to be a concern for India, since India has some of the highest tariffs of any country in the world, averaging about 17% as applied, while the U.S. is more like 3.5%. So I could see that becoming a contentious issue in the future. And I think there are going to be demands aimed at reducing these differences here and there, but it's much too early to tell what the policies will be toward India or toward many other countries for that matter. During the campaign, there were lots of trade proposals, and most of them involved higher tariffs, 10 or 20% additional tariffs on imports from all countries. And many observers think that this is actually going to happen. It's probably going to happen fairly quickly in January or February. No one knows what the percentage is going to be, but my guess is initially They will be across the board, including India, including Mexico, Canada, and other trade partners, but there probably will be a complex system of exceptions. He has proposed 60% additional tariff on all imports from China. This may or may not take place. It may well be a negotiating ploy rather than a definite policy. He has said he would impose high tariffs to block passenger vehicle imports from particularly electronic vehicles from Mexico to the U.S. As most of you know, there's a free trade agreement among Canada, the U.S. and Mexico, where the automotive sector is heavily integrated. He has threatened higher tariffs for Mexico, 25%, if Mexico fails to deal effectively with drug exports and violence. And he's also said he would do something similar with regard to the fentanyl raw materials that come to Mexico and then come to the U.S. And again, as I said before, he's looking at countries whose tariffs are much higher than the U.S. Obviously, one of the major issues, if not the major issue in the campaign, was immigration into the U.S. And I assume there will be very substantial, very early policies to try to block illegals from coming into the country. What is more important, I think, from India's point of view, is there may well be efforts to reduce the number of legal immigrants, such as the H-1B visa for professionals, which are dominated by Indian non-resident immigrants to the United States. And I think overall, you have a very clearly protectionist American first philosophy. This is supposed to increase employment in the U.S. manufacturing sector. Whether that will make significant numbers of new manufacturing jobs is always an interesting question. And clearly, higher tariffs, which are passed on, of course, to consumers and businesses, harm lower income service workers particularly. So there's a real cost there, but it doesn't seem to be figuring in very much here. U.S.-India relations. I think there are a number of very positive effects and some negative possibilities as well. India and the U.S. have been cooperating in a joint Asian defense initiative, including Japan and Australia. I would guess that Trump would continue this just because his administration is concerned about China militarily as well as just economically. There's some minor agreements which I don't think are all that significant. Logistics support, supply agreement, and then there's a combined maritime forces in Bahrain, which is useful. There are bilateral military exercises between the U.S. and India that are fairly extensive. And the U.S. most recently is the third largest investor in India with about $67 billion worth over the last 24 years. And although Apple is not the investor, Apple's major supplier, which is a Taiwanese company, Foxconn, that makes iPods and particularly iPhones in India, has invested a lot of money into India to build several factories in recent years. Obviously, India has the world's largest population with about 1.4 billion and a very high growth rate. So I think there are continued pressures by the U.S. on companies now operating in China to delink or de-risk. And I think India in the longer term should be able to increase foreign direct investment and related benefits if and when the investment climate is improved. There obviously have been, as most of you know, there have been structural reforms in India that have liberalized foreign investment in the last decade or so, modernized the bankruptcy law, labor laws, and enacted a good and service taxes that have been welcomed by U.S. and other foreign investors. And there is an India-U.S. policy forum dialogue, which met most recently a couple of months ago. It's a positive step. We don't know whether Mr. Trump will continue it or not, but it is not going to resolve major differences between India and the U.S. on agricultural subsidies in India, India's high tariffs, and lack of commitment to the WTO process, including the issue of implying custom duties on e-commerce, which is a big issue for the U.S. Other side, on the negative side, U.S. under Biden has been very concerned about Mr. Modi as a Hindu nationalist who become less tolerant of minorities, created an illiberal democracy, as they say, and wants to perpetuate his own rule. I don't think this is a big issue, will be a big issue for Mr. Trump for obvious reasons. More significant, perhaps, is the U.S. indictment a few weeks ago of an Indian government official that's been accused of seeking unsuccessfully, as it turns out, the assassination of a justice official. India is considered, along with South Africa and Brazil, among the major reasons the WTO is losing influence and power because of their opposition to most WTO initiatives. As I've said before, particularly plurilateral agreements. I think one also has to recognize that if one is criticizing South Africa, Brazil, and India policies in the WTO, there's a lot to criticize about U.S. policies as well, but we won't get into that because we don't really have time. We've talked about the fact that tariffs are very high, and a lot of Western companies consider India a difficult place to do business. And also, although I personally don't think the BRICS really amounts to much, it's an alliance that is considered hostile to the U.S., particularly now that Iran and some other countries have been added to India, China, South Africa, Russia, and Brazil. Again, the Indian relationship with Russia. India, as we all know, has been pursuing a generally non-aligned policy for decades. Is not something that makes the U.S. happy. India obviously is the third largest carbon emitter in the world after the U.S. and China, and is really not reducing its greenhouse gas emissions much, although they are certainly not alone in that respect. And one of the expectations of the Trump administration is there will be much less concern over climate change issues and getting rid of coal-fired power plants and the like. There's still a protectionist problem, which I won't go into anymore. There are shortages in parts of the country of electric power, particularly clean energy, which may discourage some investors. This has been a major problem in Mexico and also in certain parts of the U.S. India was at one point, a few years ago, the major beneficiary of U.S. generalized system of preferences. That's never going to happen again, but it probably doesn't matter because GSP has been inactive for more than 4 years. Global FDI in India, as you know, has expanded. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but as you can see by that little list, it's gone from very low levels 25 years ago to fairly substantial levels in 2020-22. But I would point out that Mexico, which has about 10% of India's population and a very negative investment climate, still gets in FDI of about 33 billion per year over the last 10 or 12 years. And India does not rank highly under the UN UNCTAD database on FDI to GDP ratio. So there's a lot of room, I think, for improvement there. I think that's something which the Modi administration is fully aware of. And there are still issues, as in many developing countries, and for that matter in the United States, infrastructure issues, workforce capabilities, business environment, all of the above. I think most of these are global problems. Maybe they're more serious in India and perhaps Mexico than elsewhere, but they're certainly not unique to India. Going now away from India-U.S. relations, trade policy toward China. Again, there's a trade war. It's been going on for quite a while, and I will guess it will be going on in one form or another for at least the next 2 or 3 decades, years and years and years. Whether it's permanent, I don't know, but it's certainly long term. China is making a major effort to overtake the U.S. in total GDP. The whole Made in China 2025 area, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, electric cars, etc., and to displace U.S. economic, political, and military influence wherever possible throughout the world. And I would say, trying to be impartial, they're doing a pretty good job of this. It's very difficult to slow this. It depends on significant parts of preserving trust and cooperation among allies, which is not a strong suit for Mr. Trump's administrations. Also, it depends on internal issues in the U.S. education, infrastructure, R&D, and probably the huge political divide between Republicans and Democrats. None of this, I don't think, is likely to get better under Mr. Trump over the next 4 years. But I would point out that there are very few bilateral issues on which there is bilateral agreement, and one of them is what I would call China bashing. So it's really hard for anyone to be moderate in this area, even if they would like to, which I don't think is the case at the moment. WTO, I'm getting short of time, so I'll move quickly. As everybody is aware, I believe, or should be aware, the WTO isn't doing much these days. The U.S. actions have made the appellate body go away, or at least become dormant. Dispute settlement doesn't work very well. India, Brazil, and South Africa are among those who have blocked a lot of initiatives that require consensus in the WTO. And I think the divide between the US, Canada, Japan, and the EU on the one hand, and India, China, Russia, South Africa on the other, is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to bridge. And you now have a president who, unlike Mr. Biden, who at least pays lip service to the WTO, you have an administration that does not believe in international alliances, Paris Club, WTO, or NATO. There are many of us who think that it was a huge mistake for Mr. Trump in 2017 to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think rejoining that agreement is essentially impossible because Democrats as well as Republicans don't like the idea. I think trade and diplomatic relationship with Mexico are going to be difficult because Mexico is effectively returned to a one-party governance system, which in itself may not be disqualifying, but it has created enormous amounts of uncertainty, and businesses, investors don't like uncertainty. And you have the drug problem and crime as well. At the same time, I don't see it very likely that there will be any meaningful discussion, or maybe discussions or resolution of trade issues between the U.S. and India during the Trump administration. India will not be a priority despite the size of the population, even though Trump is said to admire Mr. Modi. So what does all this mean? Again, we're talking about my assumptions, my guesses, hopefully educated guesses. Mr. Biden, as many of you remember, had to focus on the COVID-19 epidemic very early, and then on domestic issues, improving infrastructure, except for China, of course, recreating a U.S. computer industry, subsidizing the auto industry to stimulate domestic production of EVs and batteries, and hopefully at the same time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think Trump, like Biden and Harris, believes in a very strong industrial policy protection for key industries, but he doesn't seem to have much interest in reducing greenhouse gases for climate change. International relations improved under Mr. Biden through support for NATO, Paris Agreement, and at least lip service, lukewarm support to the WTO, and support from trade agreements, but not free trade agreements like the North America and Europe, and agreements with allies in Asia in the Pacific Economic Framework, which India sort of partially, but not totally, has supported, and the Latin American Partnership for Economic Prosperity. I don't think these are going anywhere under Mr. Trump. I don't think he really likes that kind of an agreement. Trump will probably withdraw again from the Paris Agreement around January 20 or 21st. And I think we'll discontinue IPEF and APEF discussions. When he negotiates, he seems to prefer bilateral rather than multilateral actions. I think one has to keep in mind that Mr. Trump's tariff policies and other economic policies could have a serious worldwide effect on international trade. They're almost certainly going to increase inflation in the U.S. and the cost of living for consumers, particularly when other countries retaliate, as is very likely with the EU and China and perhaps others as well. Key officials in the Trump administration argue that higher tariffs are paid by foreign exporters like China. Most economists believe this is crazy, that in fact you have consumers getting rid of the are paying the tariffs. So this will affect foreign trade and investment, but I think it's still important, given the importance of the U.S. economy and its political and military powers, for India to seek cordial relationship with Trump to the extent this is possible and it's consistent with other Indian objectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It is with great honor that we welcome